Our next reader is Dianca London. Dianca London earned her MFA in fiction from the New School and is the prose editor of Lit Literary Magazine. Her work has been featured in Lenny Letter, The Toast, Obsidian, The Village Voice, and elsewhere. She is a Cambilio Fiction Fellow, a Callaloo Fiction Fellow, a Bona Voices alumna, and a Pushcart Prize nominee. Dianca London.
I would like to dedicate this to the toast, which is soon coming to an end. I, Tituba. I was Tituba, or at least everyone thought I was. During my freshman year at a small liberal arts Christian college in Wyndham, Massachusetts, my lifelong fascination with the Salem witch trials and an empty bank account prompted me to apply for a job as a historical reenactor. For $9 an hour, I dressed in heavy cloaks, long skirts, and leather boots with golden buckles. I resurrected the past as a member of the street cast for Cry Innocent, a dramatized play recounting the trial of Bridget Bishop, the first citizen of Salem to be executed as a witch. Somewhere between the excitement of make-believe and a steady paycheck, I forgot the historical implication of something I couldn't change, my skin. As part of the required training, my fellow streetcast members and I toured the cobbled streets of Salem, guided by Nathaniel Hawthorne's wife, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne. We stood in the shadow of the custom house and filed past the House of Seven Gables as she told us of her husband's inspiration for the Scarlet Letter. She showed us the graves of his forefathers, briefly mentioning his family's involvement in the witch trials and Hawthorne's resulting guilt. We traveled to the nearby Plymouth Plantation, a living museum depicting the daily grind of the 17th century colonists. Women in bonnets with names like Prudence and Constance demonstrated how to spin wool and make candles. Later, as we walked back to the old town hall, our supervisor informed us that our meal would also be a historical reenactment. She encouraged us to come up with a name and a backstory for our Puritan alter egos, to imagine ourselves in the late 1690s and act accordingly. That night, we would dine in character. Once inside the old town hall, I traded my Gap jeans and Chuck Taylors for a linen lace-up blouse and an ankle-length wool skirt. I reached for red bodice, but my supervisor reminded me that my social status in the 1690s would have not allowed for such grand attire, so I selected a gray one instead. I pulled my hair into a bun and pinned what a veteran cast member called a coif to the top of my head before joining everyone on an empty stage. I asked people who they would portray at dinner. A soft-spoken girl, who also lived in my dorm, said she would be the apothecary's daughter. Another girl rummaged through a box of props until she pulled out a wooden smoking pipe, dropping it into the pocket of her apron, declaring that she would be an old widow with a small plot of land. The only guy in our street cast would be a blacksmith's apprentice who secretly wanted to go to seminary to become a minister. They asked me who I would be. I went for something probable, telling them that I would be Zipporah, a spirited servant girl. The blacksmith's apprentice scratched his head. Did Puritans have slaves? I shrugged and mumbled, probably. That night at dinner, we sat in the dark. Candles flickered as we drank from faux pewter mugs and ate from wooden rectangular plates that our supervisor referred to as trenchers. We were allowed the luxury of modern forks, but she highly suggested that we pretend that they weren't there. Conversations around the table focused on fictive crops, barn roofs that needed mending, and the circulating rumor that Goody Bishop was in league with the devil. I jumped at the conversation, making a snarky comment about seeing her speak to a hooved goat. My supervisor cleared her throat, placing her fork beside her trencher. Mind your place, Zipporah. She broke out of character briefly to remind me that, my servant status as a character would not have been given the privilege to speak so freely without permission or punishment. The blacksmith's apprentice wagged his finger at me in disapproval. Such a brazen tongue for a servant girl, he said. I pressed my lips together to keep myself from responding. Each shift, I walked the streets of Salem with the apothecary's daughter, the blacksmith's apprentice, and the village widow who demanded that we refer to her as Old Woman Hutchins. We handed out maps of historic Salem and helped eager tourists find their way to the Witch Museum. We hung out in Burying Point Cemetery near the tombstone of the infamous witch trial judge and the great-great-grandfather of Nathaniel Hawthorne, John Hathorne. We complained about how uncomfortable our costumes were as we sipped lattes from Starbucks. Habitually, Old Woman Hutchins ditched her pipe to chain-smoke parliaments while I checked my flip phone for texts. We relived the arrest of Bridget Bishop each day in the front of the Old Town Hall again and again until September slipped into October. More and more tourists crowded the streets of Salem, their eyes wide with excitement, and that's when it started to happen. I became Tituba. For them, it was a logical conclusion. They assumed that because I was black, I had to be Tituba. Most of the time, it was middle-aged dads or teachers leading a group of students on a field trip. Hey, Tituba, can we get a picture with you? Can you take off your glasses for us? They'd shout, waving their arms for me to come closer. The first time this happened, I rolled my eyes before explaining that no, I was Zipporah, a servant girl, definitely not a witch. But they remained unconvinced. To them, my skin color meant that I was playing a different part, a 21st century reincarnation of Samuel Parris's female slave who confessed to practicing the dark arts. My attempts to be a servant girl failed, and I became a stand-in for the most famous person of color in Salem. As the weeks passed, group after group of tourists pulled out their disposable cameras, recruiting passerby to snatch pictures of me beside them. I could only imagine how many scrapbooks or albums included pictures of me sulking, arms crossed, in modest colonial attire. Tituba, I heard one afternoon as I walked down Essex Street. Pulling my cloak closer to my shoulders, I turned around quickly, replying, I'm not Tituba. I'm Zipporah, the servant girl. In a firm but friendly voice, making sure to emphasize the word servant. A man in a crewneck sweatshirt nodded his head. Sure you are, and winked before raising his hands in the air, pleading, don't put a hex on me. The woman with him laughed, and their small child hid behind her. I forced a tight-lipped smile and gave them a pamphlet on sites of interest before turning to leave. All Hallows Eve drew closer, and I fell into the habit of handing out flyers and maps by myself. I searched for back streets and empty benches surrounding Old Town Hall, seeking refuge from the growing numbers of tourists who wanted to take pictures with me. At the end of each shift, I changed out of my historically accurate costume into jeans, a t-shirt, or a sweater, and headed back to campus, thinking about the real Tituba and wondering about her experience as a black person in a predominantly white space. Was she labeled as something that she wasn't because of her skin? I knew so little about who she was and what Salem had been like for her, and yet, 100 years later, tourists of Salem gave me her name and saw me as her. A week before the 31st, I stopped correcting tourists when they called me Tituba. I stopped smiling in the pictures they snapped. I was tired of constantly being made aware of the color of my skin by white strangers. When they called me a witch, I said nothing. I let them believe what they wanted. I let them believe that I was her. I realized that no matter how many times I told them the truth wasn't what they wanted to hear. They wanted the Black Witch of Salem, and I fit the part. Growing up in a nearly all-white town in suburban Pennsylvania, I learned at an early age that tokenism is hard to shake. In Salem, I tried to combat the pressure of the tourist demands to identify as Tituba, but in the end, I failed. Just as I had been so many times before, I was pushed into a role that I didn't want to play. I wasn't able to challenge their limited imaginations or encourage them to conjure up narratives that fell outside of historical tropes. Whether I was Zipporah, the servant girl, the infamous Tituba, or myself, I was different from old woman Hutchins, the apothecary's daughter, and the blacksmith's apprentice. I was darker. I was black. Thanks.